Welcome to this podcast in a series developed by the Nebraska Juvenile Justice Association. NJJA is a 501c3 not-for-profit public benefit association. The mission of NJJA is to improve services to youth in the juvenile justice system by serving as a resource for collaboration, leadership development, and education for juvenile justice system professionals and interested stakeholders. Our efforts are greatly enhanced with the generous support of the Sherwood Foundation. Please visit our website at njja.org to see a list of upcoming podcasts, as well as the opportunity to revisit those podcasts previously recorded. We welcome your thoughts as to potential podcast topics and interest. Welcome to the Juvenile Justice in Nebraska podcast, produced by the Nebraska Juvenile Justice Association. What episode, Trace?
11?
Episode 11. We hit double digits. I didn't know that. Interesting. Okay, welcome to the NJJA podcast, everybody. Today we have Peggy Reisher with us. This is my first time I've actually got to meet Peggy, so it's been an honor. It's been a pleasure. I'm gonna tell everybody about you, a little bit about you. Okay?
That sounds fine.
Okay. Peggy Reisher has worked in the field of brain injury for over 25 years. She helped establish the Brain Injury Alliance of Nebraska in 2009 and became the executive director in July 2013. The Brain Injury Alliance mission is to create a better future for all Nebraskans through brain injury prevention, education, advocacy, and support. Okay. So, Peggy, what brings you here today? I know we want to talk about brain injury stuff. Tell us a little bit more about you.
So I'm a social worker by trade.
Okay.
I have my master's in social work and had spent my entire career in the field of brain injury. Didn't know anything about it when I first started, but my first job, they said, "What do you know about brain injury?" I said, "Nothing, nothing at all."
Really?
But we will teach you. So I'm like, I'm all for learning. So had started my career in Indianapolis, Indiana. Then my husband and I moved back to Lincoln, Nebraska, where it is home for him. Got a job at Madonna Rehab Hospital and worked there on the brain injury unit for about 14 years. My job was to help. As individuals came into the hospital, my role was to look at helping them find resources and services out in the community.
Okay.
Only to find there's not always a lot out there. So we had received some funding to help start the Brain Injury Alliance of Nebraska back in 2009. And with that became my passion and my interest, and it's where I'm at today.
So when you first started your professional career, you had no history in brain injury at all?
None.
Wow.
Although, years later, I realized, though, that I had an uncle with a brain injury.
And that was going to be my next question, do you have a history with this?
Yeah, I kind of stumbled into the job because it was some place that was hiring, but never went into it because it was a passion of mine. But again, years later, you start to realize, oh gosh, there are a lot of people I know with a brain injury. I just didn't necessarily recognize it as such and make a big deal of it at the time. So people that have traumatic brain injuries, they obviously utilize your services. What all can you guys do for them? How do you help? Sure. Well, and I want to just take a moment to kind of define brain injury for us. There is the world that we so frequently hear people talk about traumatic brain injury. A concussion is a mild traumatic brain injury. And we certainly help those individuals. That's an individual who has a bump or a blow or jolt to the head. But also under the definition of brain injury also falls individuals who've had a stroke, a near drowning experience where they had a lack of oxygen to the brain for a while. Even strangulation can cause a brain injury. Brain cancer also causes a type of brain injury. So there's a lot of different ways in which somebody can injure their brain, and it's essentially injuring your brain after you've been born, an injury to your brain. So with that, again, we serve. Your question was, what kind of services do we provide? A lot of it's just what I explained. Sure. We do a lot of education on what is a brain injury and what are the signs and symptoms, and then how can you kind of work through those and kind of still live life successfully. Our services include outreach and education. We do a lot of also, it's kind of case management. We call it resource facilitation, where individuals can call us, ask us questions about services, supports, resources, and we help kind of guide them
we oftentimes find that there's not a lot of resources out there. So what we have to do is kind of create them and work within systems that are serving people with brain injury, whether they know it or not, and help them understand how they can do a better job serving folks, which kind of leads us to where we're at today. Finding out that there are indeed a lot of folks within some high-risk populations, which include juvenile justice, that have had a brain injury but don't necessarily know it, don't identify it as such. And so what can we do as an organization to better educate folks to help them understand, gosh, you got these folks within your system, but you just don't necessarily know it. And if you've figured it out, if you can identify it, you can do a better job serving them too.
Has there been any outreach to you or to the Alliance from system professionals, people who work with probation or work with HHS or judiciary folk? Has anybody reached out to you guys?
I would say that people don't knock on my door seeking my services. I'm knocking on all of your doors saying, hey, you're serving these folks and how can I help you? But no, other than the work that we've done here with Tom and it's just kind of doing that education piece, but a lot of folks haven't necessarily still figured out that they're serving people with brain injury and not knowing it yet.
And Tom, for everybody that can't see us, Mr. Tom McBride is here as well today. Tom, talk a little bit about what you're doing right now, Peggy.
Yeah, I'd like to kind of take a step back first. I think, when you start talking about brain injury, it's much like, other illnesses, other injuries and stuff. If you buy an orange Volkswagen, all of a sudden you start seeing orange Volkswagens. So when you start getting educated about brain injury, then, it's like, oh my gosh, like Peggy said, I had an uncle, didn't know that and stuff. You find out that it's more prevalent than what you think. When I had my provider hat on, we used to work with some kids that had severe brain injuries, and that was from physical trauma, generally. Skateboard accidents, bicycle accidents, things like that. And, sometimes knowing, oh my God, this is what we're working with puts a whole different perspective on the treatment program and how you view, that behaviors and the thinking patterns and stuff, because it's a different ball of wax. One of the things that I really appreciate about Peggy is that she believes in what she's doing. She believes in in working and getting the word out about traumatic brain injury. I think about 15 years ago, if you talked about trauma-informed care, it was a brand new subject, and people went, "Oh my gosh, this is a true thing." Traumatic brain injury in people of all ages is a real thing, as Peggy has pointed out. Years and years ago, Dr. Denise Hertz would go to the YRTCs and do a study on the prevalence of drug alcohol problems amongst the population, and found that we looked very exactly similar to programs all across the country with the rate, the prevalence rate of kids that had drug alcohol abuse problems. What would really be nice is to be able to do that same thing with with brain injuries. And that's one of the things that you've got to have somebody that's there pushing that program forward, to get it known, to get action on it, and that's what Peggy has done for years. She's been an exhibitor at the NJJA conference for several years, presenter, and so what's happening now is that, and I'll let her get into it more, but we now have the Nebraska, brain injury group is collaborating with a national group and using their resources, their guidance, and the expertise in Nebraska to, okay, let's put a program together recognizing, that this is an issue specifically in the juvenile justice field, and how are we going to address it? Mm-hmm. But I will let her do, a better explanation of how this came to be.
Great. Sure. Please, by all means, Peggy, take it away.
Sure. There, as Tom mentioned, there's a national group. It's called, it's got a long name, so they of course abbreviate, but it's the National Association of State Head Injury Administrators, also known as NASHA, that has been doing some of this work on a national level. And they invited states to put together a stakeholder group within our own state and they're providing what they call a leading action. I can't even think of it. It's got an acronym too, but essentially there's a group of us here in Nebraska working with NASHA to kind of look at what are some of the different strategies, what are some different groups that we can work with. And they've already got a lot of materials already put together. So we're not needing to recreate the wheel in many ways. But one of the there's really three main components that we're hoping to do with our group here in Nebraska is, number one, just continue to do the outreach and education piece. Get in front of as many folks as we can to train them on what is brain injury. Secondly, also to figure out how can we get folks to begin to identify it within their systems. And that usually means doing some screening, some brain injury screening. And it's not a screening of, hey, do you have a brain injury? Because most kids are not going to relate to that. Most folks aren't going to relate to saying, if you just ask that blank question. But through a series of questions, there's 5 or 6 questions that can kind of help drive down, okay, is there a history of brain injury or not? And that screen usually takes anywhere from 7 to 10 minutes. It's not super long, but at least it asks the right set of questions. And then if indeed folks are willing to do the screenings, then what can we collect some of that information so that we can begin to put numbers behind it and be able to show the prevalence of brain injury within that juvenile justice system. I was given an opportunity in December of 2019 to go into the Lancaster Youth Detention Center. Mm-hmm. And for me, it was just an amazing opportunity to screen 25 of the kids at that time. It was just a snapshot in time. But 72% of those kids screened positive for brain injury.
Wow. That's
72%. The general population, according to the CDC, has about 8.5% of the population is positive for brain injury, but this is 72. Some other national numbers that we're looking at is within the whole juvenile justice system, I think the best guess right now is about 41 to 42% of youth are screening positive for brain injury. Of course, the further you get up or deeper into the system you get, the more likelihood we're seeing that there is the brain injury.
Can you grade brain injuries on severity? Is there some kind of scale?
There is, but it's not one that we necessarily chat about at this level. Again, I go back to my days at Madonna. I mean, those were definitely individuals that had severe brain injuries because they were in comas or they needed an inpatient stay. But the majority of the youth that I was working with at the detention center are screened. It's that they had multiple brain injuries. It was more concussion level. Mm-hmm. But what we find in our world of brain injury is the more injuries you have, it just gets worse. And so what was interesting in asking the youth, they were self-reporting, but asking them, how many injuries do you think you've had? And the type of injuries we're asking for are assaults, mm-hmm. car accidents, sports injuries, bike accidents. So when we also did ask about strangulation and choking, because we know that happens oftentimes within the domestic violence world as well as within the juvenile justice population. So we had found it was in that particular screen with that group of kids, I think we had close to 40% that had 6 or more injuries.
Wow. So
you kind of dial that back. And I think Brain Injury Alliance also works a lot with with youth sports, trying to encourage people to understand a concussion is a concussion, it's a brain injury. And, 3 or more times of getting hit in the head, you probably should be looking for something else to be doing.
Yeah. And I do a lot of youth sports coaching, and we go through all those protocols and all the education that we go through and recognizing concussions and things like that. But I still think there's more that we can do for coaches. It's a big responsibility, and when you're working with these young people, the more training that us coaches can have, the better. Peggy, listen to you talk about your time in the detention center and all that good stuff has my wheels spinning. We have an emergency shelter here at Cedars, and I think about those kids and what they've been through and how many brain injuries could come from that. Diagnosis could come from that. But I also wonder about, we have 197 employees here. How do we get you in front of them? How do we get you to speak on the importance of recognition and working with young people who have been, injured in some way? So, how does somebody get a hold of you if they want you to come out and talk?
They call me. They check me. I can give you my phone number, and I don't know if you want me to rattle that off now. So my cell phone is 402-890-0606. Or they can even email me, and then that email is Peggy, so it's PEGGY at B as in boy, I, A, N as in Nancy, E.org. And that's what we're about. We're about getting in front of groups and saying this is what it looks like. And my personal passion, the reason is like, as I mentioned earlier, it's like when I left Madonna, so many of the folks that I needed to send into the community didn't have support for people that understood brain injury. So the more we can do to educate our colleagues around us, our neighbors, our friends, our family about what brain injury is, the more folks are going to feel supported of being out in the community after brain injury.
Rico, I want to jump back to something you were talking about with youth sports and stuff. You look back 10, 12 years ago when concussion protocols really started first being talked about, and where it's at today. With some of the diagnostic tools that they can use right on the field. I just had read something the other day about, is it a blood test or a urine test that can show markers of a concussion?
Really?
Yeah, there's some kind of neat biomarkers that they're starting to kind of uncover. I don't know that any of them are field ready right now. And it's certainly in the world that I live in, it's like those biomarkers, whether it's a blood test or whatnot, are amazing. But it's still not going to be for you as a coach on the sideline quite yet. But, just still understanding what are all those signs and symptoms and looking at the whole piece of the puzzle is going to be important.
But when this first came up, that was old school that, rub some dirt on it, get back in the game. And it's become more widely accepted, more, seriously accepted, by coaches, by athletic trainers, parents, whatever. And I think provider-wise and stuff, it's very similar. Well, if I don't know that, I don't have to treat that, and that's really wrong thinking. The better base of knowledge you have on the history of that particular patient, the better outcomes you have sitting in front of you later on, because you tailor the the treatment to that. Because somebody has reported at least at this point, because they've reported a brain injury or whatever, doesn't mean that you got to run out and have a PET scan or a CAT scan or something like this. Just knowing is puts a whole different, piece of the puzzle together.
So, and a question that I would have, and this is going to be a hard question to answer, and I understand that, but if we have a young person that is diagnosed with a brain injury, what do you change? And how do you go about working with that individual versus how you work with them if they never had a brain injury? Do you know what I'm saying? How do you do that?
Sure. So a lot of what we've been trying to preach to people is like, just because they screen positive doesn't mean that you need to run them to the ER for an MRI or a CAT scan. really there, especially for those more mild injuries, mild to moderate injuries, there's some really basic things you can do to help support them. So if one of the symptoms they're having is they have light sensitivity, so they walk into a bright room and the bright lights and fluorescent lights are driving, send their symptoms even crazier. It's like being a cognizant of the light sensitivity that they might be experiencing, shut down the lights, get them near natural light. If they're having a problem with processing information because you're just spewing it out quickly, there's oftentimes after a brain injury, you just need more time to process information. So it's just slowing it down, saying it more, in just a slower rate, a slower pace, that can make a difference. If they're having problems with memory, which is very typical after brain injury, write things down. Don't just assume that you can give them one bit of information and they're going to walk out the room and follow through with that because you said it one time. It's like, write it down. Give them reminders if they have appointments that they need to be at or certain tasks that you're expecting them to do. You really need to begin to look at them. Is it a won't or a can't? Are these youth really purposely being defiant after if they indeed have had a brain injury? Or is it they've been beaten in the head so many times they can't recall and do those things as you would expect them to? So going back to trauma-informed care, this is no different in my mind than anything you might talk about when it comes to trauma-informed care. Being cognizant of what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, what is it that you need to do to help make adjustments so that they can be successful.
Yeah, and I think also you got to recognize, on the more severe side of it, what part of the brain was affected. Mm-hmm. Is it speech? Is it hearing? Is it visual? Is it balance? All of those things come into play in how you address them.
Mm-hmm. This is a juvenile justice podcast, and I'm thinking in my head, what as a system, what we could do with this information, because it could be, in my opinion, it could be a game changer. It really could. I mean, in your short time at the detention center, you had how many?
72%.
72% in the detention center. So if you take that to the general population of kids who are in the juvenile justice system, that's got to be a high number. And the tools that could be given to some of these caseworkers and probation officers and providers like CEDARS and all the other ones that are out there, it could just make a huge difference. And I think some more attention definitely needs to be brought to it.
You might talk about your diversion, work with Lancaster Diversion.
Yeah, right now we're blessed to have Lancaster Diversion Group case managers or caseworkers also doing screening for us. Last I looked at our numbers, about 24% of those kids are screening positive, even at the diversion rate. Wow. And obviously we want to do more work in that area, but it's prevalent. And again, what can we do to kind of help educate? And the other thing is, and this is more of that goal down the road, but the other thing I would love to do is be able to work with the kids and help them understand, how did this brain injury affect them? And if they are, how can they use some language to help better advocate for themselves? Being able to, whether it's in front of the judge, whether it's in front of their attorney, in front of their teacher, their parent, their co-guardian, whoever, to help them understand. It's like, you need to slow this down, or I just can't process information. Give them the words, give them the tools to be able to explain to people why it is that I'm maybe not going to be able to accomplish what you're wanting me to do.
Do you have something, Tom? Oh, in your experience, when you work with these young people and you identify that they've had a brain injury at some point, how do they process that? Is there a stigma that kind of overtakes them? What is that like? I mean,
well, with just that group at 25, I didn't really go into it going, okay, I'm going to screen you for brain injury, and this is how broken you are.
Yeah, right, exactly.
That was not the message. It's like, I'm going to ask you some really simple questions and just trying to figure out, have you hit your head? Has it hurt your brain? And, that gave me a chance to get my numbers. Mm-hmm. But yeah, certainly if I could have more time with those kids, it would be to message to them. It's like, you're not broken. You have some things that you need help with. And here's how you can be an advocate for yourself. And really we have done some work within domestic violence where we're finding, we screened about 56% of those women screened positive. And then we did a follow-up with them saying, what is it that you learned from this screen and from this, extended conversation about brain injury? And they're like, it's that I'm not stupid, that I'm not an idiot, that when I choose to be by myself because I'm afraid that I'm going to sound stupid or have to answer questions that I don't know the answers to, I always thought that there was something wrong with me. And indeed, it's not something wrong with me. I've literally had a brain injury, and there's reasons why I can't do the things that I used to, but there are strategies that I can employ. And how do you, again, help them get to that point?
Mm-hmm.
I think back to, I'm of a different age than everybody else in this room. And, I see these posts sometimes on Facebook that come out from people from my generation about, we didn't have seat belts, we didn't have this, we ate dirt, and all of this, and and there's nothing wrong with me. Well, there might be. I look out, in our neighborhood where virtually every young person that I see on a bicycle is now wearing a helmet, rollerblades or whatever. I mean, that is, the message is out there that this can happen, and it can happen in an instant. I mean, it's not something that is going to take, I started seeing symptoms on this day, and years later they've diagnosed. I mean, you take a spill, as a youngster, going 15 miles an hour or whatever on a rollerblade or a skateboard, you could have a problem, not just elbows and shins. I look at, how the, within vehicles, the restraint, things in vehicles and stuff are so much better now. And they're proactive things. And a couple of years ago at the NJJA thing, I was telling Peggy about. Sometimes I go out and ride a bicycle, and my balance is not real good from this very kind of thing. And she goes, "You wear a helmet?" And I said, "No, I don't have a helmet." And all of a sudden, I had a helmet.
Yep.
That she presented me with and stuff. So, this is, I think, something that is coming about. People are paying more attention to it, and they may not be talking about brain injury. They're talking about more on the prevention side, which is really good.
Yep.
But that doesn't mean that even with wearing that helmet, you go down, something could could happen.
Peggy, I have I have kids. Tom, you have kids, and they're little ones. Do you do education on bike helmets and things like that? What to look for? If so, tell me now so I can go buy one for my kids.
Just get one. That's all I'm asking. Yeah. Just get one. Anything is better than nothing.
Sure.
And so there are different bike rodeos, and now with COVID, I don't know that anybody's doing that, but there's some different tips on how to make sure your helmet's on right. And I think and I'll never forget this. I see this in my neighborhood. It's like, so you strap the helmet on the kid, but you as a parent aren't wearing it. It's like, seriously? Well, number one, set the example. And number two is like, so if you get a brain injury, who's going to care for your kid anyway? So wear your helmet.
And fix the strap.
And put the strap on. You got to buckle it or it's going to fly off when you hit. So.
Yeah, obviously there's education has to happen. I keep thinking back to something you said when you first started. I never would have thought of all the different types of injuries or ways you can get a brain injury. I think of, I get hit in the head, I get a brain injury. I didn't think about the almost drowning and the stroke, and that's exactly why we need this education. Is because most people probably think like me, probably, but. And I didn't think of that. I didn't think like that. I didn't know that. So that just goes to show you how important your job is. It's something that has to happen.
Even the Department of Defense now is paying a lot more attention to brain injuries. predominantly from concussion. And I don't mean hitting your head in a concussion from a blast. And that is getting a huge amount of attention. I think of the NFL and the movement that they have had over the past 10 years on recognizing, the severity and I mean, they've got a fund established for players coming out of their careers that are showing effects. It's not, they talk about boxers being punch drunk and stuff, that, this may be something that really manifests itself 5 years later. But it's resultant from that. I did see a study one time where they were doing PET scans of young people who have had brain injuries, and you can actually see holes, dark spots, in the brain. And then one of the things that they were doing at that time was they were trying hyperbolic treatments. And then you would look at the comparison, and it was like night and day difference. I mean, so there's stuff out there that's going to get better all the time. But, I think one of the things that Peggy is pushing forward is, you can't sweep these under the rug. Let's identify them and recognize them for what they are, and get help.
Good.
What other thing in other ways that folks can get help, and this is, I know as we've worked with youth sports, and it's all about return to play. When can they go back to return to play? And that is incredibly important. But one thing that we've been trying to raise to the top a little bit more is the return to learn piece. So it's one thing that, these kids are players, but they're students first.
Sure.
And what can the school do to make sure that they're making accommodations for some of these kids returning with concussion or brain injury, whether it's a sports injury or an assault or a car accident? And there are some different strategies that teachers can be using too. How can teachers make those accommodations for kids if they're having if they need more time processing information? Maybe it's, instead of giving them every problem in math, it's every other one. Looking at, delaying when you expect them to finish a test, giving them quiet time to finish the test. So there's a whole bunch of different strategies that teachers need to be imploring also within the classroom. But those teachers don't know those kids are concussed until a parent or somebody tells them they are. So even though they're kind of paying attention, it's still going to be important that there's good communication between the provider or the parent or whoever, to make sure that the school is aware that these kids are needing those accommodations within the classroom too.
Well, and I think one of the things you talked about is important there is you've got to acknowledge it. And we would be working with somebody and go, oh, well, he was knocked out in this fight and he had this rollover accident, and and so you start putting the pieces of the puzzle together. Some people don't even attribute those kinds of things to what you were talking about. I think one of the things in the juvenile justice realm that we're looking at right now, and it's kind of early in the process, we can't really get into where it's going at this point, but there's discussions going on of being able to access a little more depth in the field about just at this point establishing the prevalence of it, and in doing that, there's some schools of thought that, oh my gosh, if we do that, then we've got to do what we talked about before. You got to run them off to the emergency room. You got to get all these tests and stuff, and that's not where we're at this point. But I think that's going to happen. I think there's some positive discussion out there, and it would be good, solid information to know.
Is there any good research out there that has been done regarding youth and juvenile justice system? And if so, where is it at? How do I find it? How do people that are listening find it?
Well, I would. There's not a ton out there because this is still one of those fairly new things. I would say that there's probably been a focus on it in the last 2 to 3 years. But because of our national partnership with NJJA, I can get you the latest and greatest of that information. So I'd really encourage folks to just seek me out. And if you want research articles, I can get those for you and make your life a little easier.
Great. What do you think, Tom?
This is, what Peggy is doing was so necessary for so long. And, like I said, you've got to have somebody pushing the wagon.
I want to throw something at you, get your attention here, Trace. Go ahead. Continue, Tom.
Yeah, I said you got to have somebody pushing the wagon uphill. And it's got to be somebody who, when you meet some of those roadblocks and those, adverse situations, it goes, okay, if I can't get there this way, then we're going to go this way. And that's what she does. And we appreciate that, greatly. I mean, this is, I don't want to say it's your calling in life or, your spiritual adventure or anything like that, but it is so necessary. And, thank you for everything you do to make it, to get us to where, we're at today and where we're going to be tomorrow.
Well, thank you. It is definitely a passion of mine. And it's like, what can I do to feel better about going to bed at night? And someday when I eventually retire, it's like, be nice to know that it's like I made a difference at that time.
And we talked a little bit before we started recording the podcast. Peggy knows my sister-in-law who happens to work in the brain injury unit at Madonna as an occupational therapist, and obviously she can't share too many details, but the stories that she can share and how brain injuries change lives of families, not only of the person who obviously suffers a brain injury, but the family members, and it's just it's a heartbreaking thing. But I'm sure there's stories out there that are uplifting and all that jazz too. But it's just it's just a thing. We don't talk about it. We don't talk enough about it. And I think I want to echo what Tom said. Thank you for everything that you're doing to bring light to this. It's something that has to happen. And I'll be interested to see what happens with the juvenile justice population. I think that has a lot of opportunities.
I think there are a lot of opportunities, and we just have to capitalize on the interest that there is right now, and how can we grow it? Because it can be a game changer for a lot of these kids. I think it can indeed change the trajectory of their outcomes if we can start to begin to identify brain injury.
Tom, you know everybody. You talk to everybody. Have you talked to anybody within the juvenile justice system about the possibility of some of these kids having a brain injury?
Yeah, we're we've already begun those discussions just to get to the point where we can go in and do those prevalence. Get that data. After you get that, and if somebody was saying, well, only 0.5% of the kids involved, well, that's going to move your trajectory differently.
Sure.
You come into that and go, well, 72% of the kids you're working with, that's exactly what happened with the drug alcohol program out at YRTC Kearney, is when we saw the prevalence of the drug alcohol abuse, then, wow, we need to develop a drug alcohol program out there, and Hastings, comes about. So we're in the very early stages of some of this, but, one of the great things is that on the team that Peggy has put together with the national team and stuff, are people that can move that needle, and, that are, Dr. Ann Hobbs is one of the members. And I mean, when you talk about research, that's the first person that comes to my mind.
100%.
And like I said, at this point, there's no threat to anything. We just want to see, what's happening. How often is it happening? And then we can, down the road, we can move off, whatever direction we need to, the system needs to do that. if you talk to providers across the state that have, worked with kids, both juvenile justice, child welfare, or whatever, all of them will have stories about working with kids with brain injuries. That doesn't mean that, that youngster could be sitting here at the table and, and talking with us and stuff. It doesn't mean that they, that they have a bad gait or anything like that. It's just, outward appearances look, wonderful, but it's those different, organizational skills, the learning things, that Peggy has talked about and stuff. It's everybody's had that. Everybody's seen that.
Yeah, and you mentioned providers, and I just can't help but think about some of those, nonprofit providers who are working with these kids, and they haven't the first clue on how to work with a young person with a brain injury, and that's no fault to them. They just haven't been taught, or given the opportunity to be taught. We need to do some education, and I can't tell you how happy I am to have you here today, Peggy, because it can be something that can be overlooked for some odd reason. I don't know why, but it tends to be at times, and it can't be anymore. And I'm super excited about the work you guys are doing within the juvenile justice systems. It's exciting.
Thank you. Yeah, we oftentimes term it the invisible injury because it is. And the thing is, the other thing that I found is the majority of these students, the youth, didn't go see anybody at the hospital. 65% of them were never seen within the hospital setting. So when I asked them, do you have a brain injury? That's a clinical term that they could not relate to. Mm-hmm. But have you hit your head, blah, 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 then they could relate to that. So it's no fault of of providers or the kids that you aren't talking about it yet. But again, we got to get in front of more folks and explain, okay, this is what it looks like.
Yeah. Well, what do you got, Tom? Anything else?
I just, I love this discussion. I love where it's going. I love the process that is taking place. I think it's about time. It's been around for, since cavemen had clubs, you can't treat cancer unless you have cancer. It's difficult to work with kids with brain injuries unless you realize, that this event took place that, has happened. And, like I said, as a provider, we saw it from skateboard accidents, bike accidents, assaults. It can happen in so many different ways that you don't even really realize.
So, Peggy, you mentioned you are headed. We're going to turn pages here a little bit. You are going to go to NJJA this year, or at least attend as virtually. What are you going to be presenting on?
Similar stuff that we chatted about today. We'll dig into more of what are the signs and symptoms. Then we will also talk more about what are some of the strategies, what are some of the things that providers can do within their own facilities. Again, it's not necessarily referring all out, and probably more importantly, as equally importantly, is like if you indeed have kids like this, that you are willing to pick up the piece of paper and ask those 5 to 7 questions, let me know. Talk to me. Well, let's get you signed up and get you starting to identify folks too. And then we're here as a resource. The Brain Injury Alliance of Nebraska is indeed a resource because people are like, so what, now what? Well, we're here to help you to figure out the so what, now what stuff.
So before we let you go, Peggy, I am curious, what resources are out there right now for families?
So a lot of what we encourage folks to do is call us. Again, we've got our resource facilitation program where we essentially just talk with providers and or the parents and say, what is it that you're finding you need the most help with? And really start just kind of breaking it down. What are your goals? What do you want to see accomplished? And how can we help you get there? So it becomes really one-on-one. Mm-hmm. When it comes to providers, we're not here to say we're going to take over that case. And by the way, you don't need to be a part of it. We're saying, what can we do to help you reach your goals, even with this individual, given the fact that they've had a brain injury? And how can we work together? Mm-hmm. So our main resource is us. Yeah. But we are never afraid to refer back to the medical providers if indeed that's something that somebody wanted. So we make a lot of referrals back to Madonna if somebody says, gosh, I really want to dig into this more, and you have the benefits to do it. You want to get Madonna does a great job having a mild brain injury clinic that can kind of help uncover what are some of those deficits.
So if I'm a family member and I give you a call, what's the cost to me as a family member calling you and getting this assistance?
$0.
My favorite number.
We are grant funded, so we work hard to find grants to help support the work we're doing, but we do not charge, and we do not say, show us your diagnosis before you come to us. I mean, it's like, we'll take your story and we'll help you do what we can.
So there's no charge for anything that you guys offer?
There is not.
Wow. That's neat.
Yeah, we're, like I said, right now, grant funded. We're always looking for other folks to believe in our work and partner with us to apply for even more grants. So,
Peggy, why don't you give out your contact information again, if you would?
Sure. So my phone number is 402-890-0606, and my email is Peggy, so it's Peggy at B as in boy, IANE.org. Wait a minute.
.com.org.
Yeah, which is it?
.org. You got it. Website? You guys have a website?
We do. If you essentially Google Brain Injury Nebraska, you will find us.
Okay.
But the actual website is B as in boy, IAN as in Nancy.org.
Okay. Peggy Reisher, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for this opportunity.
Can't thank you enough. Yes. Obviously, we always got to thank the Sherwood Foundation for making this possible. Sherwood Foundation is a great friend to NJJA. So thank you for everything you do at Sherwood. I think that wraps it up. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.